Chapter 30. Karakara Bazaar. Even in the early morning the sun was different above the Gerudo Desert, and Zelda felt that difference almost immediately. As its burning eye peeped over the horizon in golden splendor, the sand began to swelter, like bending from the waves of heat. For all the world it was as if the sand had been hiding that warmth inside of itself, waiting for the morning's signal to release it back into the world. She liked that thought. Had she heard it before? Somewhere. Maybe she would remember. One day. The footing on the road that snaked between the dunes was not so sure as the path they had taken through the canyon on the edge of the desert, but it was solid enough that their way wasn't impeded. Zelda had stepped experimentally out onto the dunes and found that the ground itself had fought against her progress. It recalled the effort she'd had to exert when walking through snow on Lanayru Mountain and Hylia Mountain, though the motion of walking through snow was dissimilar to that of walking atop sand. She had walked up and down a dune, getting a feel for it, and Paye's expression had become unreadable even after they returned to the road. Zelda was aware that the other woman kept stealing glances at her, even now. But she was not going to push Paye to talk. That conversation would happen whenever her friend was ready. A broad-shouldered Gerudo woman was coming down the road ahead of the Matter Run, her long strides letting her cover the distance much more quickly than Zelda could have, though she didn't think the taller woman could outrun Paye even at a sprint. Paye fell in behind Zelda to give the other traveler room to pass. "Savara," the runner said, raising her hand in greeting as she passed them. "Savara," Zelda replied, while Paye mumbled. Zelda had taught her a few words of greeting, but she wasn't confident enough to actually say them. The runner didn't stop, but she did slow her pace and look back at them over her shoulder, eyebrows raised in surprise. Then she nodded in appreciation and continued her run toward the canyon. Zelda and Paye watched her eating up the distance before turning back to the path. "The Gerudo Desert is such a nice place, isn't it?" Zelda could not help grinning. She was filled with a sense of warmth, looking at the road that wound between rolling dunes, twisting out of sight but leading inevitably to their destination. "I suppose so," Paye said. She apparently had not gotten over her nervousness from trying to speak a greeting in an unfamiliar language. "The way surely you mean the people, not the place? Especially the weather?" Zelda looked up. "It's such a clear morning. There isn't a single cloud." Paye paused for a moment. "I'm sorry, I wasn't being precise. The clear skies are part of the problem. I meant to refer to the heat." "The heat? But it..." And there, for the first time that morning, Zelda really thought about it. "I suppose it is warm. Still, it hadn't occurred to me until just now. Why am I so comfortable, I wonder?" She adjusted her hood and her tunic. She had worn her Hylian tunic to keep the sun off of her skin, just as Paye was wearing her weatherproofed hat to the same purpose, unlike Paye's outfit. However, Zelda's was not designed to keep her cool in the desert heat. Objectively, she should have been sweltering. Instead, she was merely warm. "Do you suppose that I spent much time here in the past?" Paye thought, then nodded. "The Queen, as monarch, was also the chief dignitary for the kingdom. She traveled to visit all the people of Hyrule. I'm told that you accompanied her on several expeditions, and that she spent a great deal of time among the Gerudo in particular. In that case I likely grew accustomed to the climate in my youth. In fact, I'd bet that I would have been more comfortable here a century ago. Still, more time among the Gerudo. I wonder why that would be the case. Were there particular tensions between our nations?" Paye blinked rapidly. She hadn't been expecting so many questions on pre-calamity political history, apparently. "I don't know. I don't think so. The Gerudo have been staunch allies to the queens of Hyrule for thousands of years. I couldn't say for sure, but I recall hearing that your mother was particularly popular. Grandmother would know. Would you prefer to ask her?" No, never mind. But thank you. I'm sorry. I'm preoccupied, I suppose. I feel comfortable here, even more comfortable than when I was on the plateau and it was mostly emptied of monsters. I want to know where that comfort came from. I think it has something to do with Lady Arbosa, but I can't be sure. My memory is so spotty in this regard." Paye tilted back her hat with her thumb, though not so far that the light of the sun fell on her face. "One of your memory spots is up ahead, isn't it?" "Yes, I suppose it is." She didn't like that name. Memory spots, as if her memories had soaked into the ground and were waiting for her to come back and stand in them like mud. Part of her distaste, she knew, Was that the name? And the comparison it brought to mind for her was perfectly apt. She had to leverage particular care to not show her distaste where Pi might perceive it. The photograph was taken in an open area with trees, rather than in a town. That is probably the Karakar Bazaar, which is seated on the shores of an oasis at the halfway point on the path to Gerudo town. I don't know how far it is, exactly, but it shouldn't be too difficult to reach before the sun is high. Zelda nodded and Paya lowered the brim of her hat again. The sand stretched out before them, and as they walked Zelda pored over the question of her memory. What would she see next? What would she learn? What made her love this place so, on a level that was so deep that she could recall it in the comfort of her body? Hopefully she would know soon. Zelda sat in the shade of a palm tree, the wind blowing cool and sweet off of the oasis. Her hands were folded on her lap. She had dusted the sand off of her trousers, then rinsed her hands in the water. She probably shouldn't have done that last, but she wasn't thinking very clearly and no one present would gainsay her. She found herself staring at Link, unable to take her eyes off of him, really. He stood nearby, the Master Sword in his hands, taking in the surroundings with a posture that suggested something very similar to a cat in repose. He would react instantly to anything he considered a threat, but for now he seemed almost relaxed, even though he was standing guard. Looking at him, one would never guess how he could react when provoked. One would never guess that he had left 3 bodies lying on the sand only minutes ago. Link never presumed to make physical contact with her. Even hours ago she would have thought he never deigned to do so, but that was vanity. However, after moving between the Yiga, felling them with strokes so swift she would have thought they were play-acting if not for the blood soaking into the sand. He had knelt in front of her, spoken to her, of his own volition, asked if she was injured, if she could walk, if she needed help getting up. She'd said she could stand on her own, found her legs betraying her. He'd taken her by the hand, helped her up, and led her to the tree. He'd whistled so sharply and so loudly that a guard had come to investigate, and he'd told her about the bodies on the road. The guard found them, raised a general alarm, and sent word to Gerudo town that the Yiga had tried to kill the Princess of Hyrule. The Lady Urbosa would surely come to investigate, she'd said, and then she returned to her post. So, here they were. Zelda was fairly sure that she was in shock, protected from some emotional and physical enormity by her body's natural defenses and buffers. She'd read about this in medical texts. Whatever she would have been feeling now would come, but later. Hopefully she would not make a scene, would be able to keep from embarrassing herself in front of anyone. I wonder, she thought, if it's because they tried to kill me, or because Link killed them. It was interesting that her reaction to this attack was so different compared to when she and Urbosa had been attacked some weeks ago. Well, it had been a different incident, hadn't it? That time with Urbosa, she'd never really felt the danger of the moment. Urbosa had fought so swiftly, dominated her opponents so totally, that there was no real sense of menace towards Zelda's person. More, Urbosa had not killed the men from that night. As dramatic and sweeping as Urbosa's defeat of their attackers had been, it was ultimately much closer to play acting than the instant, lethal violence that Link had visited upon them just now. Yes, quite different. Today she'd been alone when the Yiga found her. She'd been alone when steel was raised over her head, catching the light of the sun with a promise of her blood hanging in the air. She'd been alone when... Princess! Link's voice gently cut through her ruminations, pushing the dark thoughts out of her head as she looked at him. His eyes could have stopped fighters in their tracks, had done so many times. His expression was still unreadable, but she found that she no longer wished to ascribe any particular motive to that. If you need to talk, we can talk. It helps, sometimes. Thank you, she said. Not just yet. Should she also thank him for saving her life? It was his duty. He was doing as had been commanded of him by the kingdom. Would it insult him to turn it into a personal matter? None of that changed how she felt in that moment, or rather how much she knew she would be grateful when such feelings floated again at the surface. She should thank him. But he turned his head away, and the moment was gone, and the wind blew quietly across the sands, carrying the smell of water, rather than blood. She stared at his back. Before very much longer, the barking of sand seals filled the air. Shouting followed it. Zelda wasn't in the mood for more shouting, so she closed her eyes, trying to shut it out. That didn't really work, but it faded anyway, was replaced by heavy footfalls crossing the sand. A pause, more steps, the rustle of cloth, and the smell of a very familiar perfume. Zelda hadn't noticed it when resting on Von Aberus the night before, but she did now. Zelda. Little bird. Urbosa's voice was nearly choked with concern. This was a jolt through the insulation Zelda rested under. The princess opened her eyes. Urbosa was kneeling in front of her, so low that their eyes were level. The chief of the Gerudo rested one hand against Zelda's cheek. Are you all right? Yes, I think I am. Physically. She reached up with her own hand, stroked the back of Urbosa's, felt the rush of familiar warmth spreading through her chest and spine, unbinding the knots of tension throughout her body. I feel numb, emotionally, as if nothing that happened was quite real. That will pass. Yes, I've read about this before, you know. Reading it doesn't really prepare you for it, I suppose, but at least I have some idea what to expect. She paused. I hope I am still calm when this feeling passes. I will try to be. I am sorry to have worried you. She caught her eyes toward Link, knew that Urbosa saw her do so. I'm sorry that I was being childish and let this happen. Enough. No more apologizing. Urbosa's tone was firmer, now, though it still couldn't be called sharp. She shifted her kneeling to a slightly straighter posture, and Zelda had to raise her eyes to keep looking at her. Evil hearts are arrayed against you. That you are alive is more than enough recompense for me. She withdrew her hand, returning Zelda's own to the princess's lap. You need rest. You have to continue your pilgrimage, but before you go on that journey I would have you sleep in Gerudo Town again. I can make sure you are sufficiently guarded. It couldn't be said that Link flinched. Exactly. He never flinched at anything. Not one muscle tensed. Instead it was as if there was a potential for his head to turn, and then it didn't. Zelda didn't know how to explain that she knew he was reacting, she just did. Thank you for your offer. However, I fear I must decline. She sat straighter, unable to raise her head to Urbosa's level but making a try of it anyway. If nothing else, she could be composed. This incident happened because I shirked my duty to accept the god that has been assigned to me. I have used your hospitality as an escape once already. To do so again would be an insult to my protector, especially after he has proven himself so capable. Urbosa blinked, then looked over her shoulder at the hero. I suppose he did, at that. As much as I'd like to pretend otherwise, you'll be safer with that boy than you would with an army of warriors. Even Gerudo. The numbness must have mostly fallen away, because Zelda's throat tightened at the way Urbosa looked at her. She wanted to embrace the Gerudo chief, to ensure herself of Urbosa's physical reality and to ensure Urbosa that all was well between them. She didn't have to, she knew, which allowed her to restrain herself. I can see that you would like to stay, but your duty calls. Will you be leaving today, then? Yes. Immediately, I think. She was being very composed, she thought. Thank you for your generosity, and your hospitality, and for caring so much. I hope that when this is over, Never mind when this is over. When the world is heavy, and the castle presses in on you from all sides, whether the shadow of the calamity is still looming or not, you come home. Nothing would make me happier than to see your smiling face again, little bird. Zelda nodded. Urbosa rose, and Zelda followed suit. Link stood still, his eyes fixed on the dunes past which the guards were examining the bodies of the assassins. That called to mind a question. She didn't know if it was right to ask, but she'd been wondering since some minutes before Urbosa arrived. Lady Urbosa. The formality made the Gerudo chief tilt her head slightly, setting the crimson sea of her hair to waving. I do not know how to ask this tactfully. Do you think there is any possibility that the men who attacked us some time ago are the same ones as... She gestured with her hand, toward the sands of investigation. None at all. The sudden darkness of Urbosa's tone was not directed at Zelda. That was the only reason the princess could compartmentalize it as well as she did. I will examine the corpses myself momentarily, but I already know they are different individuals. Urbosa looked back toward Gerudo Town. Zelda could feel Urbosa's attention focused on the spot where she had done battle before. I let them live to spare you the trauma of watching them die, and they left under their own power, but those men will also never fight again. The wounds they took run much deeper than they know. She held up her hand, as if to snap her fingers. Whoever threatens you will meet the storm. Whoever threatens you will bear the weight of her fury. Urbosa walked away, then, rounding the dune, leaving Link and Zelda alone on the oasis's shore. Both watched her as she left. Link. And at the sound of her voice he turned, as he had turned at nothing in her conversation with Urbosa. It made her pause before continuing. I would like to speak to you. When we are away, I mean. I feel I have a lot to apologize for, and more. Besides, would you be willing to talk to me? He nodded, sheathed the master sword, went to gather their things. The sun was high over the Karakara Bazaar by the time Zelda and Pyre arrived. Aside from the trouble of actually walking through the desert, they ended up distracted by a nest of Lizalfos and Thunder Chews just off the road. Robbie's weapons made short work of them, but it took some time to comb through their possessions and catalog the remains in the wake of battle. They agreed to have lunch in the bazaar's inn before making their way to Gerudo Town. Later, Zelda would not be able to say exactly what it was that led her to seek higher ground. On some level it was probably the simple fact of wanting to be able to see a long way in the desert. How far did the hills go? In air so dry, how distant was the horizon? The bazaar's primary building, housing the inn, was dozens of meters tall, and would provide an excellent view. She took a walk around it, spied a ladder, and began her climb. Partway up, realizing she was not even breathing hard, she thought back to how difficult it had been to climb out of the Chamber of Resurrection. How had she made it out of there at all? If she went back there now, and she could, it would take only moments. How difficult would she find the climb? Were there any barrels left at all? Would she be able to get out on her own, or would she need to teleport away? She pulled herself up onto the roof, dusted off the legs of her trousers, and looked up. Oh, pardon me, she said to the back of the woman looking out over the desert. I didn't realize anyone was up here. The woman, taller than Zelda, hair long and red almost like a Gerudo's, looked over her shoulder. She was very plainly Hylian, wearing the style of surwal, top, and veil that marked women who worked the tourist path through the desert. Later she would need to unpack why she remembered that of all things. But she was so comfortable looking in her stance and her attire that Zelda imagined some more sheltered people throughout Hyrule might mistake her for one of the region's natives. Oh, don't worry, the woman replied, turning to face Zelda, really looking at her. There's plenty of room up here for both of us. I was just watching the comings and goings at Gerudo Town. My name is Vilia. Zelda inclined her head. You are very gracious, Vilia. My name is Zelda. Vilia's eyebrows leaped up over the veil. This was nearly the only form of expression Zelda could read on her face. Zelda? That's a pretty name. Powerful, too. Your parents must have had great hopes for you, to name you so auspiciously. Yes, I suppose they must have. You said you were watching the entrances to Gerudo Town. If Vilia noticed Zelda's haphazard attempt to change the subject, she gave no sign. Instead she waved Zelda over with a hand, and the princess stepped in to stand next to her as she turned back to the town. With one pointed nail Vilia pointed toward Gerudo Town. Not just the entrances, but you can watch a little drama now if you look carefully. Do you see the figure running along the wall, toward the left side of the entrance closest to us? Zelda could not see very clearly. Vilia apparently had eyes like a hawk. Zelda took the shake slate from her belt, flipped over to the viewing mode, and zoomed in on the figure in question. Even from this distance she could make it out quite clearly, a man, wearing glasses and a heavy pack, running along the perimeter of the city. That man is making good time. He should be. That's Bullseye, and I think he's an archaeologist, anthropologist, some such thing. You can't see them from here. As she had apparently not noticed the slate, but he's wearing a special pair of boots that let him run over sand as easily as more solid ground. He spent the past week or two just running laps around Gerudo Town's walls, over and over. Zelda looked up from the slate, blinked, looked over at Vilia, looked back at Bullseye on the slate. Why would he do that, of all things? How familiar are you with Gerudo Town? Zelda did not know why she wanted so badly to protect her secret in this context, but for some reason she did. It could have been embarrassment, or an overabundance of caution, or any number of things, but she did not feel like having a conversation about her amnesia, or her removal from her prior life, or the small things she did remember. So, I traveled here with my mother when I was much younger. I'm afraid I don't remember my time in the desert very well. but I still feel a connection with this place. Then I think you might already understand well enough. Though if you were that young, she said in the tone of a woman reflecting on how young Zelda still was, then you might not remember some of the ways Gerudo Town relates to the world. Men haven't been able to enter Gerudo Town for a long time. No one alive knows exactly how old the law is, or what caused it, but it's never been deviated from, officially, whether the men in question are Gerudo or not. This isn't really a problem. Most of the time, Gerudo men are exceedingly rare, and any foreign man with sense who comes to this region to trade makes sure to travel with a woman so that at least one member of his party can move freely in the city. With sense, he said.
Phileas scoffed.
You may have seen those slobbering oafs in their little tents on the edge of the oasis. They've been here for days. The leader of that party didn't think anything of the fact that his entire expedition consists of men, and now he's stuck unless he can find a woman he can trust to bargain on his behalf. And that foolishness is the most benign example you can find. The other men with him are much more typical. Typical?
It didn't take much prompting to keep Philly talking. Bullseye just kept running, while Zelda watched. From this distance, it was easy to assume he really had nothing better to do.
Zelda.
Phileas' voice was so serious now that Zelda was forced to look up at the older woman, who was staring down out of the corner of her eye.
Watch the men around Gerudo Town. Some of them, maybe even most, come here chasing riches, or knowledge. Too many, though, are here because they imagine the desert to be full of lusty maids who are longing for the embrace or influence of a man. They all invariably learn to the contrary, but before they learn...
Philly shook her head.
Every day Bullseye runs around the town, huffing and puffing, hoping that a guard, or a passerby, or anyone will take notice of how easily he moves over the sand. Like he's some kind of bird, performing a mating display. Near the height of the day he'll work up his courage, and approach one of the guards.
On the view screen of the slate, Bullseye was moving as if Phileas' narration directed him. Zelda watched him approach the guard, panting so heavily it moved his entire frame, then stand with his hands on his hips and puff out his chest. He didn't look directly at the towering, imposing woman with her even taller polearm. He was either too nervous or pretending to speak casually.
And every day he'll try to bargain with them, for passage or for company or for whatever.
After several seconds, and what looked like a long pause of awkward silence, Bullseye spoke again, and then the guard looked directly at him. She was wearing a mask over her mouth, so Zelda could not see what she said, but it must have been cutting because Bullseye flinched as if struck. The guard's partner shifted her stance, not enough to be aggressive, but enough so that she was now facing Bullseye, too. Bullseye promptly turned and ran away, running directly toward a makeshift shelter just off the road.
And every day it ends the same way. It will continue like that until he gets the idea and finally leaves.
Philly sniffed, then sighed.
And he's the least bad of all of them, the little creep.
Zelda put the slate away, taking in the wider view of Gerudo Town, not the only Gerudo city, Paya had told her, but definitely the most important for trading with the other peoples of Hyrule.
I suppose I wouldn't recall those things from my youth, she said. I spent nearly all of my time in the city itself. My mother was apparently friends with many of the people living there.
Up to this point, Philly had filled every gap of silence with more conversation, so it took Zelda several seconds to realize the other woman had remained silent, thoughtful, for that entire time. She did not turn her head. She did not look. She focused on the city, on the whole of it, how it stood in the desert, and, even from this distance, one could see gleaming streams of water running through aqueducts that had been laid between streets and buildings. Looking at it made her feel homesick. What a silly thing, she reflected, to feel homesick for a place I don't remember. And not the castle, either, but a town far from the heart of the kingdom. A chunk of memory broke loose, but rather than information and perspective it brought an emotion. She wasn't just homesick. She missed her mother, who she remembered not at all, and she missed her Boso, who she remembered nearly as little.
What brings you to Gerudo Town, Zelda? You don't seem like you're here to trade, or for tourism. Reconnecting with the past, I suppose.
The lie by omission rolled off of her tongue more easily than the naked truth could have.
I knew someone here, once, and she was very dear to me. She made this place very dear to me. I want find her, again, and I want to see this city, her home. There's something about Gerudo Town,
Billy said, and now she sounded wistful.
I envy the past you have here, you know? For all that it seems to make the men around it more stupid than usual. The streets, the buildings, the food, the art, the people. It feels like all of it's there to support you, in a way.
She waved one hand, as if to dismiss an admonishment that she anticipated.
It's not, of course. The Gerudo have a history here that goes back to before recorded history, and this place exists for them, not for Hylians. Still, it feels like this is built to help women in general. To help you see yourself more clearly.
Something in Zelda made her turn and look away from Gerudo town, out into the massive sandstorm where lightning danced, and the great shadow of a beast seemed to fade in and out of existence. For some reason, Zelda realized at this moment that she had been thinking of Ganon as masculine. Why was that? She would come back to it. She turned back to Gerudo town, and something itched at her thoughts, some revelation that was just out of her reach.
Thank you for talking to me, Velia. It has been a very pleasant conversation. I'm going back down now, so my companion and I can make our way to the city. Thank you, Zelda. It does get lonely up here. I think that.
Velia put her hands on her hips, tilted her head to the side in thought, then looked Zelda up and down.
Actually, it just occurred to me. I sell clothes, as a matter of fact, and the outfit you're wearing now looks awfully warm for this climate. Would you be interested in some of my wares?
Her first instinct was to nod, but she held this in check once she took in Velia's outfit, which was well cut and made of nice material but still had an air about it.
Are the outfits like the one you're wearing now? Oh, I know it's touristy. It's not something you'd want to wear when you're coming home and reconnecting with your past and trying to find someone you care about. It's not that there's something a tourist would wear.
It was absolutely that they was something a tourist would wear. Velia either did not hear the lie or did not care.
But, listen, I want you to consider the outfits I sell would look so cute on you. Just imagining it makes me want to scream. 600 rupees for one set is competitive with prices in town, and I dye these by hand.
Oh, thank Hylia. She mentioned the price. Zelda tapped her chin thoughtfully, then shook her head.
It's very tempting. They really are lovely. I'm afraid that the budget for our trip has been measured very carefully, though, and we just don't have much surplus. I'd be dipping into our emergency funds.
This last, at least, was true, since she considered all the gemstones they carried to be emergency funds. Velia sighed dramatically, then turned away, clearly unhurt but just as clearly intending to make a show of it.
Oh, fine. Economic realities are what they are, and I suppose it wouldn't do to let those goons in the Oasis or outside the city walls see you in something that cute.
She looked back over her shoulder at Zelda, and from the crinkling around her eyes Zelda could see she was smiling.
Still, if, on your way back, you find yourself with a little cash to spare, come find Velia. I'll be here for a little while longer, and I'd love to see you in these clothes. Or your companion, if you like.
Zelda nodded her assent, turned, and started for the ladder. She had climbed down 2 rungs when the last thing Velia said struck her, and she imagined how Paya would look in an outfit like that. That would be cute, she acknowledged. And Paya would definitely kill a vedette if she heard anyone even mention the possibility of asking her to wear it. The sun was warm as she descended. End of chapter.